Staff Sergeant William Bill Dawson
Is this yours?
never imagined his
Please, I don't want any
Tuesday
trouble.
morning coffee would end with military vehicles surrounding Rosie's diner, when a leather-clad giant decided to assault an 81-year-old Vietnam veteran. He unknowingly triggered a response that would demonstrate the true meaning of "leave no man behind." At 81, Bill Dawson still carried himself with the quiet dignity of a career soldier. His weathered hands bore the scars of 3 tours in Vietnam, while his eyes held the patient wisdom of a man who'd seen humanity at its worst and best, never losing faith in either. What began as an unprovoked assault on a defenseless elderly man would soon become a masterclass in military precision, family loyalty, and the consequences of disrespecting those who've served. The biker's moment of cruelty would collide with a lifetime of honor, duty, and unbreakable bonds forged in combat. Rosie's Diner occupied a corner lot on Main Street in Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew their neighbors and strangers were noticed immediately. The chrome and vinyl establishment had served the community for 40 years, its red booths and black and white checkered floor witnessing countless conversations, celebrations, and quiet moments of solitude. Tuesday mornings at Rosie's followed a predictable rhythm coffee brewing at 5 a.m., regulars claiming their usual spots by 6, and the gentle hum of small-town life beginning another day. The walls displayed faded photographs of local high school football teams, community events, and a small section dedicated to hometown heroes who'd served in various conflicts. The atmosphere typically radiated warmth and familiarity, where disputes were settled with words and respect was given freely to elders and veterans. But on this particular morning, that peaceful routine would be shattered by an act of senseless aggression that would test the community's character and reveal the power of loyalty that transcended civilian life. Bill Dawson had enlisted in the Army at 18. Driven by a sense of duty instilled by his Depression-era parents, who believed in service above self. 3 tours in Vietnam had tested every aspect of his character, from the jungles of the Mekong Delta to the urban warfare of Saigon. He'd earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and the respect of every man who'd served under his command. After his military service, Bill had returned to Millbrook, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 3 children while working at the local hardware store. He'd never spoken much about the war, preferring to let his actions define his character rather than his words. The community knew him as a reliable neighbor, a devoted husband, and a man whose handshake was his bond. His son Michael had followed him into military service. But unlike Bill's infantry background, Michael had excelled in logistics and command, rising through the ranks to become a full colonel. The pride Bill felt in his son's achievements was matched only by his concern for the burdens of modern military leadership. They spoke regularly, their conversations a blend of fatherly advice and professional respect between 2 soldiers who understood the weight of command. Bill's daily routine included morning coffee at Rosie's, where he'd sit in the same booth, read the paper, and exchange pleasantries with other regulars. It was his way of staying connected to the community he'd served and protected, a quiet ritual that grounded him in the civilian life he'd fought to preserve. The Army cap he wore wasn't for show. It was a reminder of the values that had shaped his life and the brothers he'd left behind in distant jungles. The biker who entered Rosie's that morning represented everything Bill had spent his life opposing: senseless aggression, disrespect for others, and the belief that might made right. The man's size and swagger immediately changed the diner's atmosphere, his presence radiating the kind of menace that made decent people uncomfortable. When the biker's eyes settled on Bill's corner booth, the one with the best view of the street and the most privacy, something in the elderly veteran's military bearing seemed to trigger his predatory instincts. Perhaps it was the way Bill sat with perfect posture despite his age, or the quiet confidence that came from facing real enemies in real wars. "Hey, old man," the biker announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "I want that booth." Bill looked up from his newspaper, his expression calm but alert. He'd faced down enemy soldiers in rice paddies and urban firefights. A small-town bully didn't intimidate him, but he also recognized the signs of escalating aggression and knew that de-escalation was always the preferred option. But the biker had mistaken Bill's peaceful demeanor for weakness and was about to learn the difference between a man who chose not to fight and one who couldn't. The biker's demand hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Bill carefully folded his newspaper, his movements deliberate and controlled. "There are plenty of empty booths, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "No need for trouble." "Trouble," the biker laughed, a harsh sound that made the waitress behind the counter flinch. "Old man, you don't know what trouble is. I want that booth, and I'm going to get it." Bill studied the younger man's face, recognizing the signs of someone looking for a fight rather than simply wanting a seat in Vietnam. He'd learned to read these situations quickly, the difference between someone who could be reasoned with and someone who had already decided violence was the answer. "I've been sitting here for 20 years, Bill replied calmly, taking another sip of his coffee. "But if you really need this particular spot, I suppose I could." The slap came without warning, a vicious backhand that knocked Bill's army cap from his head and sent his coffee cup flying. The sound echoed through the diner like a gunshot, followed by stunned silence as every patron processed what they'd just witnessed. As Bill slowly reached down to retrieve his cap, coffee dripping from the table onto his sleeve, the diner remained frozen in shocked silence. The biker stood over him triumphantly, apparently satisfied with his display of dominance over a defenseless elderly man. But Bill Dawson was far from defenseless. As he straightened his cap and wiped coffee from his jacket, his mind was already calculating responses with the tactical precision that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. Violence was always an option. His hand still remembered how to kill efficiently and quietly, but at 81, he had better resources available. "Excuse me, miss," he said to the waitress, his voice steady despite the red mark blooming on his cheek. "Could I use your phone?" The young woman nodded quickly. Pointing toward the pay phone near the restrooms, Bill walked slowly, ignoring the biker's continued taunts about teaching the old fool some respect. The phone call was brief and coded in the language of military efficiency that transcended generations. "Michael, "It's Dad. I'm at Rosie's Diner on Main Street. I've been assaulted by a civilian. Could use some backup." Colonel Michael Dawson was reviewing deployment schedules at Fort Campbell when his father's call came through. The calm tone couldn't hide the underlying message. His father, a decorated combat veteran, had been attacked and needed help. The response was immediate and overwhelming within minutes of Bill's call. Fort Campbell transformed into a hive of coordinated activity. Colonel Dawson's aide contacted the motor pool, while the colonel himself assembled a response team from his most trusted officers and NCOs. This wasn't just a family emergency, it was an assault on a veteran, and the military took such matters seriously. 4 Humvees departed the base in convoy formation, their occupants grim-faced soldiers who understood they were responding to protect one of their own. The 22-minute response time was a testament to military efficiency and the bonds that connected all who had worn the uniform back at the diner. Bill returned to his booth and sat calmly by the window, his demeanor unchanged despite the swelling on his cheek. The biker continued his performance for the other patrons, apparently unaware that he had just triggered a response that would demonstrate the true meaning of military brotherhood. "Look at him!" The biker sneered to his audience of uncomfortable civilians. "Tough guy can't even stand up for himself." "What kind of soldier were you, old man?" Bill sipped his fresh coffee. The waitress had brought him a new cup without being asked, and watched the street with the patience of a man who knew help was coming. But the biker's moment of triumph was about to become his worst nightmare. The biker's initial success emboldened him to continue his performance for the captive audience of diner patrons. He began regaling them with stories of his own toughness, how he'd taught lessons to other old fools who didn't show proper respect. The other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Caught between their desire to help Bill and their fear of becoming the biker's next target, Bill remained silent, occasionally checking his watch with the precision of someone accustomed to coordinated operations. His calm demeanor seemed to frustrate the biker, who had expected either cowering submission or futile resistance from his elderly victim. As minutes passed, the biker's agitation grew. He began pacing around the diner, his heavy boots echoing on the checkered floor as he continued his verbal assault on Bill's character, military service, and right to occupy space in his diner. Other patrons began quietly asking for their checks, eager to escape the increasingly volatile situation. The waitress, a young woman named Jenny, who had known Bill since childhood, tried to intervene diplomatically. "Sir, maybe you could just take another booth. Mr. Dawson's been coming here for 20 years, and I don't care if he's been coming here for 50 years. The biker snarled. "This is about respect, and this old fossil just learned what happens when you disrespect me." The situation escalated further when the biker decided to claim his prize, sliding into the booth across from Bill and spreading his arms across the back of the seat in a gesture of territorial dominance. "See how easy that was, old man? Sometimes you just need to know your place." As the confrontation continued, pressure mounted from multiple directions. Other customers began leaving, their departure creating an increasingly isolated environment where the biker's aggression could escalate without witnesses. The diner's manager, a middle-aged man named Frank, watched nervously from behind the counter, clearly torn between calling police and avoiding further provocation. The biker seemed to feed off the atmosphere of fear and submission he'd created. "This is how it should be," he announced to the remaining patrons. "Respect your betters, and nobody gets hurt." But outside, the distant rumble of approaching vehicles began to penetrate the diner's walls. Bill's expression remained unchanged, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the look of a soldier who knew reinforcements were approaching. The biker, too focused on his victim and audience to notice the changing dynamics, continued his monologue about respect and consequences. He had no idea that his 22 minutes of dominance were about to end in a demonstration of what real power looked like when it served justice rather than ego. The crisis revealed the character of everyone present. Bill's response to unprovoked violence demonstrated the discipline and restraint that had made him an effective leader during his military service. Rather than escalating to violence, he had chosen the tactical option that would achieve the best outcome with minimal collateral damage. The other patrons faced their own moral reckonings. Some, like Jenny the waitress, found small ways to show support despite their fear. Others retreated into silence, their inaction a choice that would haunt them long after the immediate crisis passed. Frank, the manager, struggled with his responsibilities to both protect his customers and avoid escalating a dangerous situation. His eventual decision to support Bill rather than appease the biker would define his character in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Even the biker, in his crude way, was revealing his true nature, not just his capacity for violence, but his fundamental cowardice in targeting someone he perceived as defenseless. His performance was about to be exposed for what it truly was, the bluster of a bully who had never faced real consequences for his actions. As the 20th minute since Bill's phone call approached, subtle changes began occurring in the diner's atmosphere. The rumble of heavy vehicles became more distinct, and those sitting near the windows began to notice unusual activity on the normally quiet main street. Bill's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the relaxed patience of waiting replaced by the alert readiness of someone preparing for action. The biker, still absorbed in his performance, missed these subtle signs that the dynamic was about to change dramatically. Jenny the waitress caught Bill's eye and saw something there that made her step back behind the counter, not fear, but anticipation. She had grown up in a military town and recognized the look of someone who knew backup was coming. The few remaining customers sensed the shift without understanding its source. Conversations died away as people unconsciously prepared for something they couldn't identify. The diner fell into an expectant silence broken only by the biker's continued monologue and the growing sound of approaching vehicles. Outside, 4 military Humvees were converging on Rosie's diner. With the precision of a tactical operation, their occupants prepared to demonstrate that assaulting a veteran had consequences that extended far beyond local law enforcement. And then the cavalry arrived. The rumble of diesel engines grew louder until it became impossible to ignore. The biker paused mid-sentence as 4 military Humvees pulled up outside Rosie's diner in perfect formation, their presence transforming the quiet street into something resembling a combat zone. Soldiers emerged from the vehicles with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They weren't in full combat gear, but their bearing and discipline made it clear these were serious military personnel responding to a serious situation. Colonel Michael Dawson stepped out of the lead vehicle, his uniform crisp and his expression grim. At 4-5, he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. But the concern in his eyes was purely personal. This was a son responding to his father's call for help. The biker's bravado faltered as he took in the sight of armed soldiers positioning themselves around the diner. "What the hell is this?" he stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Inside the diner, Bill remained seated calmly, but those who knew him could see the pride in his eyes as he watched his son approach. This wasn't just military backup. This was a demonstration of the bonds that connected all who had served, transcending rank, age, and generation. The few remaining customers pressed themselves against the windows, suddenly understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The elderly man they'd watched being assaulted wasn't just any veteran. He was connected to people with the power and authority to respond with overwhelming force. Colonel Dawson entered the diner with the measured stride of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. His eyes immediately found his father, cataloging the red mark on his cheek and the coffee stains on his jacket with the clinical assessment of a soldier evaluating casualties. "Dad," he said simply, his voice carrying both concern and barely controlled anger. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, son," Bill replied, his voice steady. "But this gentleman seems to think he can assault elderly veterans without consequences." The biker, suddenly realizing the magnitude of his error, attempted to backpedal. "Look, this is all a misunderstanding. Your old man and I just had a little disagreement about seating arrangements. No harm done." Colonel Dawson turned his attention to the biker, his expression shifting from filial concern to professional assessment of a threat. "Sir, you assaulted a decorated combat veteran, a man who served 3 tours in Vietnam and earned 2 Purple Hearts defending the freedom you enjoy. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a federal crime." The biker's face went pale as he began to understand the gravity of his situation. Federal crime? It was just a slap? The old guy's fine. "The old guy is my father," Colonel Dawson replied, his voice deadly quiet. "And you're about to learn what happens when you assault the family of an active-duty military officer." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. The biker could attempt to flee, escalate the confrontation, or surrender to the inevitable consequences of his actions. His choice would determine whether this ended with simple arrest or something far more serious. The biker made his choice the wrong one. Instead of accepting responsibility, he chose defiance. "You can't intimidate me with your toy soldiers," he snarled, standing up from the booth with his fists clenched. "This is America, not some military dictatorship." His words triggered immediate responses from the soldiers positioned around the diner. Hands moved to weapons. Stances shifted to tactical positions, and the atmosphere became charged with the potential for violence. But it was Bill who diffused the situation, rising slowly from his seat with the dignity that had defined his entire life. "Son," he said to the biker, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced real enemies in real wars. You've made enough mistakes for one day. Don't make any more. The simple words, spoken with quiet authority, cut through the tension like a blade. The biker found himself facing not just military personnel, but the combined moral authority of 2 generations of soldiers who had earned their respect through service rather than intimidation. Colonel Dawson nodded to his men, who maintained their positions but didn't escalate. "Sir, you have 30 seconds to sit down and wait for local law enforcement, or we'll assist you in making that decision." Now came the moment of truth. Justice would be served, and lessons would be learned. The biker's defiance crumbled under the weight of overwhelming military presence and his growing understanding of the consequences facing him. He sank back into the booth, his earlier swagger replaced by the nervous energy of someone realizing they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Colonel Dawson positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with both his father and the threat, his training evident in every movement. The soldiers under his command had taken positions that controlled all exits, while maintaining a professional bearing that demonstrated discipline and restraint. "Frank," Colonel Dawson addressed the diner manager, who had been watching the proceedings with growing amazement. "Would you please call the local police? We have a citizen's arrest situation here." Frank nodded quickly, reaching for the phone behind the counter. The few remaining customers sat in respectful silence, understanding they were witnessing something significant, not just the arrest of a bully, but a demonstration of the protective bonds that connected military families across generations. Bill remained seated, his composure intact despite the morning's events. This wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about consequences and the kind of justice that came from standing up for what was right. As they waited for local law enforcement, the biker made one final attempt to minimize his situation. "Come on, this is ridiculous," he pleaded, looking around the diner for support. "It was just a slap. People get into arguments all the time. You're making this into World War III. Colonel Dawson's response was measured and professional. "Sir, you committed assault and battery against an elderly veteran in many jurisdictions. That's considered a hate crime with enhanced penalties. You also did so in the presence of witnesses and, fortunately for the prosecution, security cameras." He gestured toward the small camera mounted above the diner's counter, its red light indicating it had been recording the entire incident. The biker's face went white as he realized his actions had been documented from multiple angles. "The footage will show that my father attempted to de-escalate the situation, offered to give up his seat voluntarily, and was assaulted without provocation." Colonel Dawson continued, "It will also show that he made no aggressive moves and posed no threat to anyone." The weight of evidence and consequences was becoming clear to everyone present, transforming the biker from aggressor to defendant in a case he couldn't win. The arrival of local police marked the beginning of the formal justice process. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a veteran himself who had served in Desert Storm, entered the diner and immediately assessed the situation with the eye of someone who understood military protocol and civilian law enforcement. "Colonel Dawson." He nodded respectfully, then turned to Bill. "Staff Sergeant Dawson, I heard you had some trouble this morning." The use of proper military titles and recognition of service created an atmosphere of respect that stood in stark contrast to the bikers' earlier behavior. It also demonstrated the network of mutual support that existed among veterans regardless of their branch of service or era of conflict. The biker attempted one final manipulation, appealing to Sheriff Bradley as a fellow civilian against what he characterized as military overreach. "Sheriff, this is getting out of hand. All I did was ask the old guy to move, and suddenly the whole army shows up. This is supposed to be America, not some police state." Sheriff Bradley's expression hardened as he absorbed the biker's attempt to portray himself as a victim. "Sir, from what I understand, you assaulted an 81-year-old combat veteran. That's not asking someone to move that's committing a crime." The biker's face flushed with anger and desperation. Assault. It was barely a tap. "Look at him, he's fine. You're all making this into something it's not because he's got connections." This attempt to minimize his actions and dismiss Bill's military service proved to be his final mistake. The room's atmosphere shifted as everyone present, military and civilian alike, recognized the fundamental disrespect embedded in his words. Sheriff Bradley stepped closer to the biker, his voice carrying the authority of law enforcement backed by moral certainty. "Sir, I've reviewed the security footage while my deputies were setting up outside. What I saw was an unprovoked assault on an elderly man who was sitting peacefully in a diner." He gestured toward the camera above the counter. The footage shows Staff Sergeant Dawson attempting to de-escalate the situation, offering to give up his seat, and being struck without warning. It also shows him making no aggressive moves and posing no threat to anyone. The biker's last hope for minimizing the situation evaporated as the legal reality became clear. "But I didn't know he was military," he protested weakly. If you'd known what?" Colonel Dawson interrupted. "That he deserved basic human respect, that elderly people shouldn't be assaulted, that actions have consequences." Bill finally spoke, his voice carrying the wisdom of 8 decades and the authority of a lifetime of service. "Son, it shouldn't matter if I was military or civilian, young or old. What you did was wrong, and you knew it was wrong when you did it." The simple truth of his words silenced the biker's protests and created a moment of clarity that cut through all the excuses and justifications. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the biker's transformation from aggressor to defendant was complete. The charges: assault on an elderly person, assault on a veteran, and disturbing the peace would carry significant penalties, especially given the clear video evidence and multiple witnesses. But the real victory wasn't in the arrest, it was in what happened next. A young boy who had been sitting with his grandmother in a corner booth approached Bill with wide eyes and obvious awe. "Sir," the boy said, his voice small but clear, "are you really a soldier?" Bill smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd shown all morning. "I was, son, a long time ago." The boy straightened his small shoulders and attempted a salute, his form imperfect, but his intention pure. Bill returned the salute with military precision, and the diner erupted in spontaneous applause. The contrast was striking where the biker had brought violence and disrespect. The child had brought honor and recognition. It was a reminder of what the mourning had really been about, the values that defined a community and the importance of standing up for those who had served. In the days following the incident, Rosie's Diner became a gathering place for veterans and their families. Drawn by the story of what had happened and the demonstration of military solidarity, the booth where Bill had been sitting was quietly designated as the Veterans Table. With a small plaque honoring all who had served, the biker pleaded guilty to assault charges and was sentenced to community service at the local VA hospital, where he would learn firsthand about the sacrifices made by the people he had dismissed as old fossils. But the real transformation was just beginning. The incident at Rosie's Diner sparked a community-wide conversation about respect for veterans and the importance of standing up against bullying. Local businesses began displaying veteran-friendly signs, while the town council passed a resolution declaring Millbrook a community of honor, committed to supporting those who had served. Bill became something of a local celebrity. Though he remained characteristically modest about the attention, he used his newfound platform to speak at schools and community events about the values of service, respect, and civic responsibility. Colonel Dawson's response was praised by his military superiors as an appropriate use of resources to protect a veteran and demonstrate military values. The incident became a case study in military academies about the bonds that connect all who serve and the obligations that extend beyond active duty. The story spread beyond Millbrook through social media and military networks, inspiring similar demonstrations of support for veterans across the country. The phrase 22 minutes became shorthand in military circles for the rapid response time that demonstrated how quickly the military community rallied to protect its own. Bill's story led to the creation of a veteran mentorship program pairing elderly veterans with young service members, fostering connections across generations and ensuring that the wisdom of experience was passed down to new leaders. The diner itself became a pilgrimage site for military families, with visitors from across the region coming to see the Veterans Table and hear the story of what had happened. Frank, the manager, eventually expanded the display to include photographs and stories from local veterans of all eras. The incident also influenced local law enforcement training, with Sheriff Bradley implementing new protocols for responding to veteran-related incidents and ensuring that all officers understood the legal protections available to elderly and disabled veterans. Bill discovered that his ordeal had given him a new purpose in his later years. He became an active advocate for veteran rights and community engagement, using his story to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. His relationship with Michael deepened as they worked together on veteran advocacy projects, their shared commitment to service creating new bonds beyond their father-son relationship. The incident had reminded them both of the values that had shaped their lives and the importance of standing up for those values. Bill's story demonstrates that respect isn't earned through intimidation or violence, but through service, character, and the courage to stand up for what's right. It reminds us that the bonds forged through military service create a network of support that transcends rank, age, and time, ensuring that no veteran stands alone.